Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute, Artnet News' new micro-podcast, hosted by our European news editor, Margaret Kerrigan. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news, expertly compiled by the Artnet Pro editorial team. Art Market Minute airs every Monday, so be sure to tune in.
If MoMA is kind of too big of a ship and they're not going to be connected to the art in the way that they may want.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's the central tension, right? I mean, people talk about the need for diversity and change of voices at the top, and it's like, these are executive roles, meaning it's like, these are the people who fire people. I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from Artnet News. It is time for our September Roundup, where we talk about some of the art news stories of the last month with our writers here at Artnet News. We are going to be talking today about 3 stories. For those keeping track, we're talking about the retirement of long-serving MoMA museum director Glenn Lowry here in New York, which marks the end of an era and maybe the beginning of something new. We're talking about a story that I wrote about who the artists who are showing most in U.S. museums right now are, so a window into the zeitgeist. And then we're going to be talking about a rediscovered painting by the beloved Baroque painter Artemisia Gentileschi that is going on view in Texas. And here to talk about those 3 things with me is Kate Brown, our senior editor, and Art Angle co-host, Kate Brown in Germany. Kate?
Hey, Ben. How are you?
And I'm very excited to be talking with Sarah Cascone, our senior writer here in New York and the hardest working woman in art news.
Oh, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kate. So excited to finally be on the roundup.
Yay.
Sarah, you are, along with me, we've both been at Artnet for a long time, since the beginning, for like a decade now, and you are famously productive. You are constantly turning out stories, and somehow on top of that, you also seem to be everywhere. Have you seen anything that you liked this September as people went back into the galleries?
Oh, yeah. It's been a busy back to school for me. I have a new baby who turns 9 months old today while we're recording. So I took him to a lot of art, which was fun.
That's right.
I also managed to see some art without him. Yeah, I started off this Armory Week with the Bottom Freedom for Everybody, which was a truck of contemporary artworks organized by Project for Empty Space with the Times Square Art Alliance. And it's going on a tour across the country with art by Barbara Kruger on the truck and on the outside of the truck. And it's going to be all about trying to convince people in maybe red-leaning states that bodily rights, people should have bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom and reproductive rights and trans rights. So it's pretty cool. I saw Spring Break, my favorite emerging art fair with all the cool installations.
You're like maybe the world expert on Spring Break art fair here in New York.
What do you love about it?
I just think it's so fun. Like, the artists are all there. They're really eager to share their work. I just think that the artists at Spring Break are really passionate about their work, and they're not really beholden to market forces the way that more established artists are. So they're just more down to earth and more connected to their practice, in my opinion. And they're just showing great things.
Yeah, Spring Break Art Fair has kind of a grassroots feeling to it, despite, being an art fair. It always brings out a good crowd. It feels nice to be there.
Yeah. And then, I saw like a crazy C.J. Hendry flower market with like hundreds and thousands of flowers, and the show got shut down by the police because there was too many people coming to get these $5 flower sculptures.
That was such an Instagram phenomenon. I was like watching that, and I was looking at it late at night, and I thought that I was like, I need to get my eyes checked. Those flowers look blurry. And then I realized that they were like fabric, which is why I couldn't see them properly as flowers. Did you get to take one home?
I went with Annika Olson, one of our coworkers, and we each got 3 free flowers, and then we could buy more for $5. So we got a bouquet.
What is this? I actually kind of missed this. It was not part of my Instagram feed.
It's just this Australian artist, C.J. Hendry, and she does these very interactive, experiential pop-up art shows that are connected to her hyper-realistic drawings that she sells for tens of thousands of dollars, but then the public can come for like a nominal fee and experience her fun thing of the moment.
Yeah, and she famously doesn't have gallery representation by choice.
I will say that I didn't even see where the drawings were. I just was like in a tent of flowers. I didn't even see the actual art.
Kate, what about you? What have you seen in Germany lately?
I finally made it to the Andy Warhol exhibition at the Neue Nationalgalerie called Velvet Rage and Beauty, which Klaus Biesenbach has curated. And it was a very interesting show because it basically was about looking at all of the work that had been sanitized in a way from Warhol's practice over the years, and really like looking at the prism of the erotic male gaze that he had, was such an important part of his practice from the very beginning. And it started with these like amazing drawings that he made in like the late 1940s. And several of them were lent from Daniel Buchholz's collection. It was a really beautiful show. I was really glad to finally see it. What about you, Ben?
Been making the rounds. Went to a show at the Amant Art Foundation here in Brooklyn, which opened a trio of shows by Loretta Fahrenholtz, Dietmar Busa, and Jenna Bliss. And kind of an interesting combination of exhibitions, actually, which had it all. Queer fashion photography and experiments with AI and digital art and satire of the art world. And I don't know, still thinking about these shows, it felt like kind of naughty oddies throwback material, like the museum world curving in a different direction or curving back, but also like something new. So still thinking about it. An interesting contrast to some of what we'll talk about today when we get to what's going on in the bigger museum world. And on that note, I think we should turn to the museum world. So the first item we want to talk to is a big piece of news in the New York art world, and I think in the larger art world, because Glenn Lowry is such a large figure. Kate, do you want to introduce this?
Yeah, Glenn Lowry is leaving the MoMA, which he had steered for 3 decades, coming into that position in 1995, and he will be leaving into retirement in September 2025. Was this news surprising to you guys at all? Because I had heard, or read rather, that some of the gossip around New York was that he would stay until 2029. So some people thought it was sooner than expected.
Well, they have a position that leadership should retire at 65. I mean, famously, Museum of Modern Art absorbed PS1, which became MoMA PS1, and its founding director, Alana Heiss, she, despite being its founding director, stepped down when it was time. And they made an exception for Glenn Lowry to stay on. They opened the way to him to stay on until 2025. And so, yeah, there was definitely the sense that maybe he could keep going on forever. But it's not like a surprise in the sense that I was staying up nights thinking about, the feature Glenn Lowry at the moment. Although, it comes hot on the heels of earlier this year, one of our reporters, Brian Boucher, was at the Talking Galleries Summit, and Glenn Lowry was there with some other museum leadership types. And the headline quote from that was Lowry saying that the finances of the MoMA does keep him up at night. So that looms in the background of this retirement decision. Sarah, what about you?
I maybe thought that he had already announced his retirement, to be honest. I know that there's just a lot of museum directors that have or are about to retire here in New York. So I think I kind of assumed that he was already part of that group, because I think we had the Whitney director, Adam Weinberg, step down last fall, as well as Richard Armstrong at the Guggenheim. So those were the two. Yeah. And now, just recently also, the Frick announced the successor to Ian Wardropper, who recently had announced that he was retiring. So that's 4 of the big 5 museums. I don't know what Max Holein is up to at the Met, but he better watch out because it's a changing of the guard.
He's pretty new, though. I think he's part of that like new wave. Yeah. So it's the Whitney, the Guggenheim, now MoMA, and the Frick that will all have new directorships. And it's Alex Ruger who's taking over at the Frick. He's coming from the Royal Academy in London.
It definitely feels like there's a changing of the guard, for sure. Those figures that you just mentioned were all people who kind of defined the New York museum world for at least a generation. I mean, Lowry is the longest serving head of MoMA and saw it through a bunch of expansions. I've never known a world without Glenn Lowry. He started at the Museum of Modern Art before I was in college. If you're under 30, you've literally never lived in a pre-Glenn Lowry world. So he really is a MoMA as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see who they pick, because I believe one of his quotes around his retirement announcement was, it's not like what can we change at the museum, but what can we preserve through this transition. So I think it'll be interesting to see, because I'm sure the board that will be looking for the next lead is going to want to see certain elements of continuity. We should talk about his legacy a little bit, but first maybe we should talk about who we think or what names are in the hat that might replace him. One name that's been floated a lot is Thelma Golden, the very influential director of Studio Museum in Harlem. Some people were saying that could be a pick also because MoMA and Studio Museum have been partnering recently on a series of programs.
Yeah, there's clearly some kind of hunger for partnerships in that direction. I mean, the Studio Museum is an important museum founded to spotlight Black art coming out of the exclusions in U.S. museums like MoMA. And now I feel like those conversations might be converging again.
Well, I think Thelma would be an interesting choice because the Whitney Adam handpicked his successor, Scott Rothkopf, and the Guggenheim and the Frick both turned to Europe. So to have a Black woman at the helm of the biggest modern and contemporary art museum in New York City would be a big move for the MoMA.
For sure.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think there's a lot of conversation about the demographics of the museum and the need for demographic change, the need to diversify the audience, to diversify the leadership, and so on. It's interesting because Lowry, in my mind, is Mr. Corporate MoMA. And I think kind of largely because of his leadership, MoMA is a force and it's undeniably the central institution for canonizing modern art and to a great extent contemporary art. And it's really important what happens there. But I think Lowry's legacy is that he was a cool hand on the tiller, but has left behind a museum that feels kind of mollified. It does. I mean, he spearheaded the current building by Yoshio Taniguchi, which I am not a fan of. I mean, it just feels like being in a big box store as far as I'm concerned. So I feel like Thelma Golden, because of the kind of activist roots of the Studio Museum and the conversation around Black art, although I should say, I imagine that she is a pretty broad-minded person, would bring a lot to the position beyond that, would mark a shift in a direction towards changing things up a little, although people said they have been in partnership recently.
But it'll be interesting if someone like Thelma Goldman would be interested in the job, because it is such a fundraising related position.
Yeah.
The Guggenheim went in a completely different direction. They had someone from NYU Abu Dhabi, Marit Westerman, and she's not even from the museum world. So I wonder if some of the big names that are being tossed around, if MoMA is kind of too big of a ship and they're not going to be connected to the art in the way that they may want.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's the central tension, right? I mean, people talk about the need for diversity and change of voices at the top. And it's these are executive roles, meaning it's these are the people who fire people. These are people who raise money from rich people and fire people.
Yeah.
Those are the key functions of an executive at that level.
And fight against wage raising for the staff and this kind of thing, which I think was also a bit of a kink in the legacy of Lowry.
And come to represent a certain degree of inequality that infests the museum, because Lowry makes upwards of $2 million a year. And the museum world is racked with questions and conversations about compensation inequality, fair pay, fair treatment, and investing in initiatives to change all that.
Some other names that are being floated is Franklin Searmans, the director of the Perez Art Museum in Miami, which would be really interesting too, and Melissa Chu from the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington. There's also Michael Govan from LACMA. It'll be interesting to see what pans out. I guess they'll be announcing it early next year or something like that. What's your impression overall of the past 30? I mean, it's a longer conversation than we have time for, but if you just span through Glenn Lowry's career, highlights he's a scholar of Islamic art. He came in the 90s, as you mentioned earlier, he merged PS1 with the MoMA. Are there any exhibitions that stand out or, news stories of that sort of time frame that stand out?
Obviously, there's the big expansion that he led that I think most people would find was successful. The museum is much bigger now. They were able to kind of re-examine the museum collection and tell a broader story about art that is not just so Abex, big white male from the 60s, 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a big part of his legacy.
Yeah, I mean, he's expanded the museum, expanded the endowment. It's got more than $1 billion in endowment now. He has expanded the audience, although the audience at MoMA, like all museum audiences, hasn't bounced back from the pandemic yet.
Oh, actually, I was reading that it had welcomed 10% more visitors in 2022 than in 2019. It was maybe one of the few, but then also I think that number might not be totally accurate because 2019 they were closed for a lot of the year doing the rehang, but they did share that number with the art newspaper.
I mean, I think it is a super tanker as a comparison people always have, and it's the flagship of a certain kind of art history. And like Sarah said, they have been responsive to a certain extent to like changing up what they do. They have been protested. Leon Black, who was part of the board, has this very complex, controversial relationship to Jeffrey Epstein. That became a huge point of protest, and I had to deal with that. You know, museums are under a lot of contradictory demands. I think if you just grade him objectively, to a certain extent, he's been pretty adept at weathering rough waters, but he is also like Mr. Pragmatism. You know, he has pretty vocal about that museums should be able to sell off things in their collection that they don't show. That's a real controversial topic in the museum world.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. This is maybe just what is on my mind. It's not really fair because this is a recent thing and he's been there for quite some time, but you know, they had this Rafiq Anadol show, who's this digital artist, and it was a show where the artist sold NFTs, like digital artworks, based on the MoMA's collection, and then shared the proceeds with the museum and then got a show in their lobby. And again, at the same summit I mentioned that Brian Boucher was at, people asked him about this. Isn't this kind of weird? Is MoMA heading in this like pay-to-play direction? And he was like, look, museums got to change, you know. I think we're at a real pivot point in museum history. It'll be interesting to see who they pick because it'll tell you something about what they think the most of all the many contradictory issues that exist, because they've been protested for various things. They also have funding problems. They are protested for the sources of their funding. So who they pick will give a sense of what they think it's most important to contain. But I think we're definitely at a moment of change and transition in the museum world. And although he leaves saying, you know, like, I accomplished everything I wanted to do, and so what better time to leave, essentially, it is also like, you know, he's leaving at a time when it's like there seem to be more and more and more difficulties in the museum world, and we really can't guarantee that it's going to go on the same way.
I think it's just an interesting time to be looking at the museum world in New York because there's about to be a lot of change. All these museums just basically finished big expansions with the exception of the Guggenheim, but they're even opening in Abu Dhabi supposedly next year. So look forward to seeing what comes next.
Well, speaking of museums, I guess I wanted to throw into the conversation this article that I wrote about what's going on in U.S. museums more broadly. So I spent a little bit of the first part of September, well, you were running around with your baby looking at art shows. I spent them in front of a spreadsheet looking at which artists are showing in U.S. museums. A little bit inspired by a project that you and I did a couple of years ago, Kate, about which artists had shown most in world biennials over the last 5 years. But this was just looking at who was showing simultaneously this month, because it occurred to me that that might be a interesting way to see what artists were on the rise. And sure enough, I got back a very interesting list of artists, or interesting to me. I don't know if they're interesting to you, that were not exactly the figures whose names would have come to the top of my mind as the people who were most important now. So I'll tell you who the top 5 were, and you can tell me if they surprise you. The most visible artists, as in the artists who are showing at the most number of museums simultaneously, are Marie Watt, Jess T. Dugan, Suchitra Matai, Theaster Gates, and Justin Favela. What do you guys think about that list?
Well, First of all, my first thought, I loved this story and that you did it, especially in the same month that we released our intelligence report, where there's also a deep data dive into rising artists, but with totally different metrics. And I loved working on the biennial project with you, Ben. And I appreciate that you did this because it's not like there's auctions submitting information. So you really have to comb through it, but it brings really interesting results. I was surprised to not know several of these artists.
Yeah.
Of course, I know Theaster Gates, he dovetails with the market. He's quite an art star, but Suchitra Matai, I had seen that work before, but the three other artists, Justin Favela, Marie Watt, and Jess Duggan, they were new names to me. And after reading this piece, I want to talk to the team about them and stuff because they sound like really interesting artists.
I really like Marie Watt. I first saw her work at, I think, the Denver Art Museum back in 2017. She does these beautiful kind of towers of blankets. Mm-hmm. They're Native American blankets, or maybe some of them aren't, but it's about the Native American tradition of blanket making. And they're just very beautiful. So I've seen her work before. I actually am working on a story about the Suchitra Matai show at the National Women of the Arts.
Oh, yeah, which is opening or just opened, I think.
Yes, at the National Women in the Arts, but I actually haven't seen her work in person before. And then, of course, Theaster Gates. But the other two, no, I didn't know. I didn't know Jess T. Dugan, and I didn't know Justin Favela. Ben, I have a question about the methodology a little bit, because the Jess T. Dugan show at the SFO Museum at San Francisco Airport that they have, I don't know, have you been to the SFO museum, quote unquote?
I have not been to the museum. I've seen the photos of the show in the museum, though.
So I will say I go to San Francisco a lot, and I do know that they have exhibitions there, but it's literally always like my husband and I'm like, oh, can we look at this? And he's like, no, go to the gate, go, go, go. And I'm like, we have 45 minutes. No. So I don't know how many people actually look at the art. If they're anything like my airport experiences, it's very hard to actually see an exhibition there.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of these things where I like this exercise because it is an alternative to looking at things through the lens of the market. And I think it turns up a different group of figures, and also just kind of a way for me to look at what's going on outside of New York. But it's not really an objective way to do this. So you have to kind of weight things. So the way I weighted things is that I valued people who were having named solo shows or retrospectives at multiple places, followed by exhibitions dedicated to them, specific commissions at museums, biennial appearances, and then inclusions in group shows. And each gave those a different score and then added up that score. So I think Jess T. Dugan, that is one of the places they're showing, but they are on the exterior of the Grand Rapids Art Museum. At the same time, they have a show at the Ringling Museum, and then are in just multiple group shows. I really was just looking for people who had extensive presence. You could see them all across the country. And, Jess T. Dugan is a figure I only heard about earlier this year. They were, I think, the last artist included in the International Center of Photography at 50 show. They have this project that looks at older transgender people, portraits of them. And that is the project that is also shown at the SFO Museum. And clearly, just in this moment, a subject that a lot of museums all across the country, the question of spotlighting queer individuals, trans individuals, is clearly on a lot of curators' minds. And I think what you see in this list is really spotlighting marginalized identities is what is on a lot of museums' minds.
What I think is interesting is there's actually not a ton of overlap with that biennials project that the two of you did. I think Theaster Gates and Suchitra Matai both had a couple of biennial appearances. Maybe Theaster might have had more, but the other three are not artists that really were on that list.
I just want to say, talk about methodological questions. Look, Theaster Gates is represented by Gagosian, has turned his earnings into the Rebuild Foundation, which has opened a complex of art spaces in Chicago. So I had to decide with him, do I count the show by him that just opened at the Stony Island Arts Bank, which is his museum? And I guess I had to ask myself, well, if they have shown other artists there, and I think I would include them because it's a significant public art space.
But also another thing I was thinking about when I was looking at their work as a group was that Marie Watt, Justin Favela, and Suchitra Matai, in spite of having distinct focuses in their practice, are working in this very large scale very proficiently with different, but almost with this sort of textile-like material, even if it's not actually textile, like Favelas is not. It was just interesting to see that as well as a sort of visual trend.
Yeah, Jesse Dugan does portrait photography. All the other ones work in different ways with kind of symbolically charged craft materials. That's what's really interesting. Maria Watt works with blankets and textiles. Sujitra Matai works with fabrics, often cut up saris. Installations relate to her experiences or family's South Asian forced immigrants to Guyana. Theaster Gates, of course, he is famous for using materials that relate to like Black history and kind of almost found object art sometimes, but a lot of storytelling. And Justin Favela, who's an artist I didn't know much about, works with piñata making. Like he's most famous for these enormous sculptures of cars done in the piñata style, and is part of a show at the Sonoma Museum called Cruisin', Lowrider Culture and the Art of Justin Favela, or something like that, where it's about lowrider car culture and it combines that with his sculptures. So a lot of community making, a lot of like community craft projects, and overall a very like spectacular and affirmative perspective.
Ben, how did you find some of these museums? Were you just looking for different museums geographically? How did you kind of do the searching?
Well, I took a list of the 200 biggest museums or top museums. That returns a bunch of names that have repeats. And from there, you look at the names who return most on that and you see where they are also showing. And that leads you to give a sense of like who is who relative to who. Look, when we did that biennials project, Kate, I got so much out of that. But I also learned, Albert Laszlo Barabasi, who runs a data lab at Northeastern University. And he invited me up there and he was like, that's such a valuable project. I got so much about it. I'm so glad you did that. I, as a data scientist, would never have done it like that because there's no central data source for these things. Like you have to kind of admit there's a little bit of subjectivity and probably some guesses and then just acknowledge that and be open to corrections and appreciate what it gives you, which is like a list of some figures who you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I think the fact that we all feel a little bit like, oh, these are figures that we should take a look at is proof to me it was worth doing.
For sure. Well noted about his comments about the methodology, but I do think it's important to try. I wondered how that whole biennial project would land, but the artists that were in it, as far as I understood and heard, were excited that the project was done. Like I know some artists don't like being reduced to data points, but I think for artists that are on the museum circuit and in the sort of institutional circuit, they do get largely like ignored. And some of them are often struggling financially, which is a truth that we need to talk about. So I think these projects, like bringing them to light through data and, noting that there's a subjective element to it, but it does something for their careers, and collectors will hopefully be knocking on some of these doors.
The data doesn't have to be perfect for there to be valuable information in it. You're still identifying artists that are doing a lot and working really hard and having their work recognized, but maybe overlooked in other ways. So I think it's valuable.
It said something to me about the museum brain, where curators' heads are at right now, the kind of conversations that they're having in this particularly, like we were saying before, difficult moment for museums. And maybe on that note, let's go to this story from Texas. Speaking of spotlighting the changing conversation in museums and spotlighting different kinds of figures, we wanted to talk about this Gentileschi painting. What's this story? Sarah, you wrote this one.
Yes, I have written many a story about Artemisia over the course of my time here at Artnet. And actually, I wrote a paper on her in college, so it's been going back even further. There is a long-lost Artemisia Gentileschi painting that just joined the collection of the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. The painting is titled Penitent Mary Magdalene. Artemisia is kind of known for painting female figures, scenes from the Bible in which women figure prominently. This one was well known in its day and copied, but the original had kind of gotten lost in the shuffle, and it popped up in 2001 at a Paris auction. It was probably one of those sleeper paintings where the people who were bidding on it had a sense that it wasn't by the studio of Artemisia. They thought it might be the real thing, and it's since been identified as the real thing. And the museum just recently purchased it from a New York art dealer, Adam Williams Fine Art, for an undisclosed amount of money. And now it's on view. It's pretty exciting whenever anything is rediscovered, especially by a great Baroque female artist.
Well, yeah, and maybe I bungled that transition because in my head, the connection here is that what's interesting is that a big development in the old master market, maybe the big development in the old master market in the last few years has been a lot of interest in old master painting by women or of Black subjects. I think these conversations about representation are filtering backwards into the conversations about what museums collect.
Curious. So it was rediscovered in the sense that it got attributed back to Gentileschi. Can you speak a bit about how that all went down? Because when they were bidding for it, it was from her studio at that point, right?
Yes. It was identified as the work of the studio, but there was some overpainting that had kind of covered up her shoulder and her upper chest, made it a little bit more demure.
Very mindful.
Very demure, very mindful.
They cleaned it up. They found that there were some details that really couldn't be seen in the copies that could be seen more clearly in the painting that's now at the Kimball. In the background of the painting, there's a curtain that's hanging, and it's very similar to a drapery that's in the Judith beheading Holofernes painting by Artemisia.
Her most famous painting.
Yes. And in this original, you can see that it's a tassel, but the painting would have been dirty and covered in soot from candles. So people who were copying it couldn't necessarily see what it was. So in some of the copies that are well known, it's a weird piece of wood on the back of a chair that doesn't really make sense. And then there's a jar of ointment and a mirror next to her, which are the symbols of Mary Magdalene giving up her worldly life. And those are much more clearly seen in this painting than in the copy. And then there are also what they call pentimenti, which are revisions to the composition. If you look at an X-ray image, you can see where the artist changed their mind and redid a detail, which normally a copyist wouldn't revise the composition. So those are some of the ways in which they realized that this was the real thing.
Wow.
Do you like this painting? I mean, do you guys connect with it?
You know, I do think that this painting is not perhaps as powerful as Judith beheading Holofernes, which is, of course, her most famous painting. It's supposedly Mary Magdalene in this moment of repentance, giving up her sinful life, but she looks a little sleepy. It could just be a girl home from a party in the process of getting ready for bed. I'm not sure that it really tells the story as effectively as maybe some of Artemisia's other works.
I mean, I guess what I ask is because I like Artemisia, but I'm a little suspicious. I am not a connoisseur of Baroque art, so I can't really tell you how good this is. And I think it's actually a fairly conventional painting. There are Caravaggios that are similar. She was very inspired by Caravaggio, including Caravaggio has a Judith slaying Holofernes that inspired her. And, you know, I think there's a little bit of a tension in this rediscovering of female old masters where people want them to be two things at once. They want them to be these like female professionals who survived in like very hostile professional world, but they also wanted to be personal expression. And those are two different things, actually, because to be a professional at that time is like you were working in conventional subject matter. Katie White, for the site, one of the early three things, a look at three things about a painting was about the Artemisia, Judith slaying Holofernes. And one of the things I took away from that is that there's a very powerful painting. People often interpreted about her as being about her own sexual assault, just the aggression in it. But it's a conventional, like people were being commissioned to do this subject matter in the Counter-Reformation because Judith symbolized the church taking things back from either the Protestants or the Ottoman Turks. And, you know, Holofernes is a symbol of Islam. So I think some of what's going on in the painting gets lost beneath some of the biography, Kate.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear. Her positioning of repose, you know, her eyes are closed, is definitely not the sort of strongest figure that I've seen. Like Artemisia's paintings that really strike me are her paintings of women, sometimes where they're looking at you, they look at the viewer, or they're like in these moments of action and they're really like the protagonists of the painting, even if they're, you know, supposedly antagonists in the historical sense. And this painting is just so neutral. It's in such a neutral position and it's such a passive position. So in that sense, like, because I'm also a victim of the narratives around Artemisia, like it goes against my like narrative about the kind of paintings that she makes. I also have a question about the attribution science, quote unquote. You know, we're just talking about like imperfect methodologies. I was reading your piece, Sarah, and I was definitely struck by the science behind these attributions, like the subtle interaction of light and shadow and the treatment of Magdalene's neck, that being the thing that like cinches the deal. It does feel like there's a lot of pressure, of course, and I'm not doubting the authenticity of this painting, but I just wanted to ask what you guys think about this kind of reattribution pressure, because it's for sure a thing.
Well, Sarah, as you point out in the piece, there are a couple of famous versions of this painting that were painted after this painting. And so people knew that there was an original version of this. And I don't know. Yeah, that kind of connoisseurship is suspect and always has been. I mean, there's like, if you read Bernard Berenson, who's like the person who originated a lot of this kind of connoisseurship, a lot of it was this really superstitious stuff about like how different artists painted earlobes and stuff. And you'd acquire a knowledge of like earlobes, and that would be like an artist's signature. And a lot of that proved to be bunk later. But, again, I'm not a connoisseur of Baroque painting, so to a certain extent, I'm flying blind here.
Bit of magic involved.
Have either of you read The Lost Painting by Jonathan Haar?
No.
Oh.
No.
If you ever want to get into the weeds on the science of connoisseurship, it is incredible. It's about this Caravaggio that was rediscovered at like a Irish monastery, and like the great aging Caravaggio connoisseur is able to re-identify it as the original. It's very interesting because it becomes like this quest for him to find one last painting. And I find this sort of stuff super fascinating. For the Artemisia, I do find the stuff about the light and the neck hard for me to see personally, especially, I guess, not looking at the painting in person. But I do think that the pentimenti can be a good telltale.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The jury's concluded that this is a real Artemisia. I was just noting the sort of, as you say, the earlobe, like the subtlety of what distinguishes these paintings is quite remarkable.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of wizardry in I think a museum as well as, authenticators have an interest in building up this kind of mythology that both guides you to look at something, but also creates something. Like it creates something in painting. Same way that storytelling does, I think some of that's in there and some of it is imagined or wishful. And it's kind of interesting, particularly just to be honest about how that's playing on you as someone who's looking in on these discussions. And I think on that note of mystery, I think that's a fine place to leave people to go see for themselves, see what they see in this painting. It is delightful to talk with you both. Kate, thanks for phoning in.
Yeah, thanks. This was fun.
And Sarah, I'll see you out at the galleries.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kate.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.